Hello, this is Dr. Lori. Welcome back to a further discussion on the data collection for the two different types of observational cohort studies that we were looking at before. As a review, there are a couple of ways of collecting these groups, these cohorts. One is to just simply take a random sample from this population or some kind of representative sample, and the other is to focus in on some exposed group and be able to compare them to a not exposed group. So let's take a look at some of the things that, and sometimes this discussion helps people to kind of differentiate between those two, is how would we collect the data. So I like to think about at the beginning of the study, where exactly on this 2x2 table are we starting? So here we have one of the great useful tools in epidemiology, the 2x2 table. And if I start out with this population and I draw a random sample from that, basically I'm starting down here in the corner that's the total. All the people that are in my study, I don't know who has disease yet, I don't know who is exposed to that particular exposure risk factor yet. So I start off down here in the bottom. And then once I have that whole entire group of people, then I ask a couple of different things. First of all, who's exposed and who's not exposed. And so then I can basically fill in the information that would be in these two boxes here, if I were to make them into boxes. But then, remember, I need to follow them forward in time. I need to go forward and find out of all of these people, how many of them ended up developing disease, and of the not exposed, how many of them ended up developing the disease. So I'm kind of going in this fashion. I start off with my total, and then what I don't know is I don't know exposure or disease. So I have to find out about exposure status, either yes, no, and then once I know exposure status and follow them forward in time, then I need to find out about whether the disease happened. Now, in both of these cases, whether I'm collecting the data that happens to be at baseline or out after a certain amount of time has gone by, I can collect that information in a variety of different ways. I can find out about their exposure or outcome by interviewing them, by looking at their physical exam or their lab or their imaging. Sometimes I have access that's connected in so that whenever their labs are drawn or imaging is done, then it just automatically comes to my study. So all of those things are ways of finding out. Now, the downside to this is, let's say that time has gone by. I'm out here in my study, years and years and years keep going by. And I find out, oh my goodness, I should have asked about some other risk factor. I didn't even know that risk factor existed. Maybe there wasn't even a blood test for it back then. But once I've gotten out this far, I can't generally go back and find out about exposures that happened back at the beginning. So I'm limited to only the exposures that I collect way back then. And we'll talk about an exception when we talk about the nested case control study. But in general, I'm stuck with the exposures that I asked about. And this is a problem with a lot of these long-term studies where with Framingham, wouldn't it be so amazing if we could have the C-reactive protein from the 1950s? Well, we don't have that. We didn't collect that information. Perhaps we didn't know to ask about the difference between different kinds of carbs or fats or proteins in a person's diet. Maybe we didn't have that on the questionnaire. So since we don't have the information, then we can't use that. I have to ask about that exposure at the beginning, and then I'm stuck with those. Those are the ones that I can study. And the second big limitation is this whole idea of time. A lot of these diseases take a long time to occur. And so I collect it and then I wait around for years or decades sometimes. So that time frame, all that time, we're not getting an answer to a question that we're wondering about. And so that can be a real limitation for these studies that take so much time to get to that particular outcome. And a lot of lifestyle diseases are that way. Now, this other type of study design, the one where we start out with an exposed group, and a not exposed group, we've gone back in time to find out those particular things. It's retrospective. And so I solve a little bit of that issue with time, because right now I'm collecting information about the outcome that's happening. And so the thing that I like to point out in this case is that I'm really forming my groups. I'm forming an exposed group, and I'm forming a not exposed group. I can come up with a total down here, but this is really who I'm starting with. When I take some kind of a sample out of the population, I'm looking for exposed and not exposed. And so this is in contrast with the case control study where I started down here at the bottom. Remember, I'm looking at cases in control. So here I'm looking at exposed and not exposed. And again, I still should have included this, disease, yes and no. And then what I do is I fast forward to current day, and I say, okay, now let's figure out if that person, if the people in each of these groups ended up being disease, yes, or having that particular outcome of interest that our study is looking at. So I didn't start off down here with a group that's the overall group. I can combine them and get an overall number, but I started off with my exposed group and my not exposed group, and that has some special things that have to do with analysis. So basically, at the beginning, I do know exposure at the very beginning of this study, and often I find out about that exposure based on previous records, either employment records, previous hospital records. I'm looking back to see what happened back then. What do we have that's recorded? Now again, I'm limited only to the exposures that I have some kind of record of, that I have data that I can depend on. What I don't know yet is the disease status, and so then I have to fast forward to today, and then I collect that information, and that can be collected in a similar way to our other up here, how we collected the data. I can interview people, I can do a physical exam and find out if they have that particular disease, whether it's hypertension. I can look in the chart, I can look in their lab. A lot of times studies will ask participants if they can please be connected with their health information, their electronic medical chart, so they can gather information about whether they've had a heart attack or whether these kinds of things have happened over time. So that is a summary of the ideas and the kind of processes where we collect the data for these two types of observational cohort studies. Thank you for joining me.